Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly, drop a comment below, and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in and let's begin. The wedding dress felt like a burial shroud as Marguerite Dubois stood before the preacher in the tiny church of Silver Creek, Colorado, her trembling hands clutching a bouquet of wilted wildflowers, while her father's gambling debts echoed in her mind like thunder before a storm. The man beside her, tall, weathered, and silent as the mountains that surrounded their settlement, was a stranger whose name she had learned only 3 days ago when her father had shaken hands with him over a poker table, sealing her fate with the clink of silver coins that would save their family from debtor's prison, but cost her everything she had dreamed of for her future. Lucien Moreau's eyes were the color of winter storms, distant and unreadable as he spoke his vows in a voice that carried no warmth, no joy, only the practical resignation of a man who needed a wife to cook, clean, and bear children on his isolated ranch, where the nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away across terrain that could kill the unwary. His calloused hand was gentle when he slipped the plain gold band onto her finger, but she could feel the strength in those fingers that had shaped timber, broken horses, and survived 15 years alone in country where weakness meant death and loneliness was just another hardship to endure like winter cold or summer drought. The ceremony was witnessed by a handful of townspeople whose expressions ranged from pity to disapproval, as everyone in Silver Creek knew that arranged marriages born from desperation rarely produced the kind of happiness that frontier life promised to those brave enough to seek it. The preacher's words about love, honor, and cherishing seemed to mock the reality of a transaction that had been negotiated like the sale of livestock, while the kiss that sealed their union was brief and passionless, leaving Marguerite feeling more like purchased property than a bride beginning a new life with someone who might someday care for her as more than just a solution to domestic problems. The wagon ride to Lucien's ranch passed in silence, broken only by the creak of wheels and the soft sound of tears she tried to hide behind the veil that had belonged to her mother, who had died believing that her daughter would marry for love rather than necessity. The landscape that rolled past was beautiful and terrible in its vastness. Endless grassland dotted with cattle, purple mountains that touched the sky, and a sense of isolation so complete that she understood why her new husband had paid her father's debts in exchange for companionship that couldn't be found in saloons or purchased from traveling merchants who visited the territory twice a year. When they finally reached the ranch, as sunset painted the sky the color of fresh blood, Marguerite saw her new home and felt her heart sink into despair that made her wedding day tears seem inadequate for expressing the magnitude of what she had lost. The cabin was sturdy but small, surrounded by nothing but endless prairie and a silence so profound that it seemed to swallow hope itself. While Lucien's first words to her as a married woman were a quiet instruction about where she would sleep and a warning that breakfast needed to be ready before dawn, because ranch work began with the sun regardless of weather, season, or the personal feelings of people who had made commitments they weren't sure they could honor. 6 months earlier, Marguerite's life in the bustling town of Denver had been filled with dreams of marrying for love, teaching at the new schoolhouse, and building a future that would honor her mother's memory while proving that French immigrants could prosper in America through hard work and determination. Her father, René Dubois, had been a respected clockmaker whose precision instruments were sought by railroad companies and mining operations throughout Colorado Territory, while his reputation for honesty and craftsmanship had provided their family with comfortable living and social standing that seemed secure until gambling fever infected him like a disease that destroyed everything it touched. The transformation had been gradual at first. Evenings spent at poker tables in respectable establishments where businessmen discussed investments and territorial politics while playing cards for stakes that seemed reasonable to men whose incomes could absorb occasional losses. René's initial success had been intoxicating, as his mathematical mind and careful observation gave him advantages over opponents whose drinking and overconfidence made them careless about odds and betting patterns that he could read like the intricate mechanisms of timepieces he repaired with such precision and patience. But success at gambling created confidence that led to larger stakes and more dangerous games, while René's growing addiction to the excitement of risk made him blind to the warning signs that experienced gamblers recognized as indicators that luck was turning, and wise men should walk away before losses became catastrophic. The underground gaming halls where he began spending his nights were controlled by men whose understanding of mathematics was limited to calculating how much they could steal from fools who believed that cards were governed by chance, rather than skill and systematic cheating that separated marks from their money with ruthless efficiency. The night that destroyed their family began with René's discovery that his largest customer had defaulted on payment for chronometers worth 6 months of income, creating financial pressure that made the gambling tables seem like reasonable sources of quick money rather than sophisticated traps designed to exploit exactly the kind of desperation that clouded judgment and made poor decisions seem like calculated risks. His attempt to win back what had been lost only accelerated the spiral into debt that consumed first their savings, then their home, and finally, their hope for any future that didn't involve servitude to creditors whose patience was measured in days rather than months. When Marcus Kane, the territorial gambling boss whose network of illegal games had been destroying families throughout Colorado, offered to forgive René's debts in exchange for his daughter's hand in marriage to a lonely rancher who needed a wife and was willing to pay handsomely for the right woman, Marguerite understood that her father's weakness had created a situation where her sacrifice was the only alternative to outcomes that would destroy them both. As she watched him sign papers that transferred ownership of her future to men who viewed women as commodities to be traded for profit, she realized that love was a luxury that poor people couldn't afford when survival required choices that civilized society preferred not to acknowledge. Lucien Moreau had come to Colorado Territory 15 years earlier as a young man fleeing memories of the Civil War that had claimed his brothers, his farm, and his faith in human nature's capacity for anything beyond cruelty and destruction. The homestead claim he had staked in the remote valley beneath Eagle's Peak represented his attempt to build something good from the ashes of everything he had lost. While the isolation that kept him safe from the violence that seemed to follow civilization also protected him from the kind of emotional connections that war had taught him to view as vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit to cause maximum pain. The success he had achieved through relentless work and careful planning had created a ranch that prospered despite its remoteness, as his understanding of cattle, grass, and weather patterns had been learned through necessity and refined through years of making mistakes that taught lessons more valuable than anything formal education could have provided. His reputation for fairness in business dealings and reliability in fulfilling contracts had made him wealthy by frontier standards, while his complete lack of interest in the social activities that brought isolated ranchers together for dances, barn raisings, and other community events had earned him respect, but no friendships deeper than business relationships. The loneliness that had driven him to contact Marcus Kane about finding a wife was not romantic longing, but practical recognition that ranch operations requiring 2 people couldn't be managed indefinitely by someone whose advancing age and accumulating injuries made physical labor increasingly difficult. His decision to purchase a bride rather than courting available women in Silver Creek or Denver had been motivated by understanding that his personality and lifestyle weren't compatible with the kind of social interaction that traditional courtship required, while his willingness to pay significant money for the arrangement demonstrated his serious commitment to making the marriage work despite its unromantic origins. His expectations for married life were modest and practical. A woman who could cook nutritious meals, maintain a clean household, and eventually bear children who would inherit the ranch that represented his life's work, and ensure that his sacrifice in building something worthwhile from frontier wilderness wouldn't be wasted when age or injury ended his ability to manage the operation personally. His hope that companionship might develop between them was genuine but secondary to his need for domestic partnership that could make isolated ranch life sustainable for someone whose health was beginning to show the effects of decades spent doing dangerous physical work in harsh conditions. The guilt that Lucien felt about purchasing a wife from a desperate father was complicated by his recognition that frontier life offered few alternatives for people whose circumstances made conventional social relationships impossible. While his commitment to treating Marguerite with respect and consideration was based on moral principles that war hadn't destroyed, despite challenging everything else he had believed about human nature and divine justice. When he had first seen her photograph and read Kane's description of her situation, his decision to help her family while solving his own problems had seemed like the kind of practical arrangement that benefited everyone involved. But the reality of seeing tears in her eyes during their wedding ceremony had awakened emotions he thought he had buried along with his brothers in unmarked graves scattered across Virginia battlefields. The cabin that became Marguerite's prison was clean, but sparse, with furniture built for function rather than comfort, and windows that revealed endless prairie where nothing moved except grass bending in wind that carried no sounds of human activity or familiar civilization. Her daily routine was established by Lucien's quiet instructions, delivered without emotion or explanation. Breakfast before dawn, dinner when he returned from checking cattle, and supper by lamplight while they sat in silence that felt heavier than the mountain air that made breathing difficult for someone accustomed to Denver's lower altitude and busier atmosphere. Lucien's attempts at conversation were awkward and brief, limited to practical matters about household supplies, weather conditions, and ranch operations that required her understanding but not her opinions or emotional involvement. His courtesy was impeccable but distant, as he treated her with the same careful politeness he showed to shopkeepers and business associates whose services he needed, but whose personal lives were none of his concern. The separate bedrooms that preserved her privacy also emphasized the business nature of their arrangement, while his obvious discomfort with any interaction beyond necessary domestic coordination made clear that intimacy was neither expected nor welcome in their current relationship. The isolation that surrounded their cabin was total and oppressive, as days passed without seeing another human being or hearing sounds beyond wind, cattle, and the occasional coyote howl that reminded her how far she was from everything familiar and safe. Her letters to friends in Denver went unanswered, either because mail service was unreliable or because people she had known were uncomfortable maintaining correspondence with someone whose circumstances had become an embarrassing reminder of how quickly respectability could be lost through family misfortune and poor decisions that affected innocent victims. The depression that settled over her was darker than winter storms that trapped them in the cabin for days, while snow piled against windows and firewood supplies dwindled to levels that made warmth a precious commodity to be conserved through careful rationing. Her tears were shed privately in her room where Lucien's considerate silence couldn't intrude, while her dreams were filled with memories of her mother's laughter and hopes for the teaching career that had been sacrificed to pay for her father's weakness and gambling addiction that had destroyed more than just their financial security. The breaking point came during a blizzard that lasted 5 days, when cabin fever and accumulated grief combined to create emotional crisis that no amount of polite distance could contain or resolve through practical arrangements that ignored human needs for connection, understanding, and hope that circumstances could improve through something more meaningful than simple endurance. When Marguerite finally collapsed in tears that had been building for months, her sobs echoed through the cabin like sounds of something breaking that couldn't be repaired through careful planning or considerate silence. While Lucien faced the realization that his practical solution to loneliness had created new problems that his experience with ranch management hadn't prepared him to address. The sight of Marguerite's breakdown shattered something inside Lucien that he had thought was permanently frozen by war and years of solitary living, as her tears revealed pain that went far beyond the inconveniences of frontier life into territory involving fundamental questions about human dignity and the right to choose one's own destiny. His decision to approach her cautiously, like gentling a frightened horse, was based on instincts that had been developed through working with animals whose trust had to be earned through patience and consistent kindness rather than demanded through force or purchased through transactions that ignored their essential nature. The conversation that followed was halting and difficult, as neither had experience with the kind of emotional honesty that their situation required, while years of protecting themselves from vulnerability had created barriers that couldn't be dismantled through single moments of good intention or recognition that changes were necessary. Lucien's admission that he had been lonely enough to buy a wife revealed desperation that matched her own family's circumstances, while his acknowledgement that their arrangement was unfair to someone who deserved better created the first genuine connection between them based on shared recognition of their mutual predicament. Marguerite's description of her life in Denver and the dreams that had been sacrificed to save her father from consequences of his gambling addiction provided Lucien with understanding of what his money had purchased, not just domestic services, but the complete destruction of a young woman's future for the sake of an old man's mistakes. Her intelligence and education became apparent through stories about her plans to teach children whose families had immigrated to America seeking opportunities that their home countries couldn't provide, while her passion for learning and helping others revealed character that had been hidden beneath the grief and resignation that frontier isolation had created. The proposal that emerged from their honest conversation was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of maintaining the polite distance that had been slowly killing both of them, they would attempt to build genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared effort to create something meaningful from circumstances that neither had chosen but both had to live with regardless of their personal preferences. Lucien's offer to help her establish a school for ranch children whose education was being neglected due to isolation represented the first time since their wedding that either had suggested possibilities for improvement rather than simply enduring what couldn't be changed. The transformation that began with that conversation was gradual but unmistakable, as shared work on converting part of the barn into a classroom created opportunities for cooperation that revealed compatible personalities beneath the awkwardness and pain that had characterized their early months together. When Marguerite smiled for the first time since their wedding while describing lesson plans for children she had never met but already cared about, Lucien felt something warming inside his chest that he hadn't experienced since before the war had taught him that caring too much about anything made its inevitable loss unbearable. The transformation of the old barn loft into a schoolroom became a project that consumed their autumn with planning, construction, and careful attention to details that would create an environment where learning could flourish despite the challenges of frontier life. Lucien's carpentry skills, developed through years of ranch maintenance and improvement, were perfectly suited for building desks, benches, and blackboards that would serve children whose families lived scattered across hundreds of miles of territory where formal education had been impossible until someone with Marguerite's training and dedication made it available through personal sacrifice and determination. Word of the planned school spread throughout the region with the speed that only good news could achieve in places where hope was scarce and opportunities for improvement were even rarer. As ranch families who had despaired of providing their children with proper education began making plans to bring them to Silver Creek for instruction that could prepare them for futures beyond the limitations of frontier subsistence. The letters that arrived from parents whose children had been learning to read from Bibles and almanacs demonstrated hunger for knowledge that formal schools had never needed to cultivate in regions where education was assumed rather than treasured as precious opportunity. Marguerite's excitement about teaching again brought color back to her cheeks and light to her eyes that had been absent since her forced marriage, while her enthusiasm for planning lessons and preparing materials created energy that transformed the cabin from a place of silent endurance into a home where important work was being accomplished through cooperation between two people whose partnership was developing beyond the practical arrangements that had brought them together. Her laughter at Lucien's attempts to help with lesson planning was the first genuine joy either had experienced in months. The changes in their relationship were subtle but significant, as shared purpose created opportunities for conversation that went beyond household logistics into territory involving dreams, memories, and hopes for the future that included both of them working together to achieve something meaningful. Lucien's growing appreciation for Marguerite's intelligence and character was matched by her recognition that his quiet kindness and steady reliability represented qualities that many women would value more highly than the romantic passion she had once believed was essential for happiness. The first test of their developing partnership came when a late blizzard threatened to destroy months of work on the schoolroom, requiring emergency efforts to protect materials and equipment that represented their combined investment in a future that could benefit children throughout the territory. Their success in saving everything through coordinated action that required trust, communication, and mutual dependence created the foundation for understanding that their marriage might become something more valuable than either had expected when their relationship had been based entirely on financial necessity and practical convenience. The arrival of ranch families bringing their children for the new school's opening created the first social gathering at the Moreau Ranch since Lucien had built his cabin 15 years earlier, as wagons loaded with supplies, bedding, and excited children transformed the isolated property into a temporary community that buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the kind of hopeful energy that accompanied new beginnings in places where progress was measured by individual initiative rather than government programs or institutional support. Marguerite's transformation from reluctant ranch wife to confident teacher was complete and inspiring, as she organized students ranging in age from 6 to 16 whose educational backgrounds varied from complete illiteracy to surprisingly advanced knowledge gained through parents who had sacrificed to provide books and instruction despite the challenges of frontier life. Her ability to assess each child's needs and create individualized instruction plans demonstrated professional competence that impressed parents who had worried that their children would remain ignorant of everything beyond ranch work and survival skills. The classroom that had been carved from barn space buzzed with activity as children who had spent their lives in isolation discovered the excitement of learning alongside peers who shared their curiosity about the wider world, while Marguerite's patient instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography opened intellectual horizons that many had never imagined could be available to ranch children whose futures had seemed limited to following their parents' occupations without alternatives or choices. Lucien's role as school administrator and maintenance manager brought him into regular contact with parents whose appreciation for his wife's dedication was expressed through genuine friendship that made him part of the community for the first time since settling in the territory. His reputation as a fair and reliable businessman expanded to include recognition as someone who was contributing to regional development through support for education that would benefit everyone's children, while his obvious pride in Marguerite's accomplishments created respect for their partnership. The success of the school's first session exceeded everyone's expectations, as children who had arrived unable to read left with skills that would allow them to continue learning at home, while their excitement about returning for future sessions demonstrated that education could flourish in frontier conditions when dedicated teachers were supported by communities that valued knowledge and progress. When the last family departed with promises to return for winter session, both Lucien and Marguerite understood that they had created something valuable that transcended their personal circumstances while strengthening their own relationship through shared achievement that neither could have accomplished alone. The letter that arrived with the winter mail delivery carried news that shattered the fragile peace Marguerite had built around her new life. As her father's death in a Denver gambling house fire revealed debts that exceeded even what Marcus Kane had been willing to forgive, leaving obligations that could destroy everything she and Lucien had created together. The legal documents that accompanied notification of Renee's death made clear that his creditors considered his daughter responsible for settling accounts that had accumulated since his original debts had been transferred to pay for her marriage arrangement. Kane's arrival at the ranch 3 days after the letter brought threats disguised as business propositions, as his casual suggestion that additional services might be required to satisfy outstanding obligations carried implications that made Lucien's careful politeness seem inadequate for addressing problems that couldn't be resolved through reasonable negotiation or appeal to civilized standards of behavior. The gambling boss's obvious assessment of Marguerite as property that could be transferred or utilized for different purposes revealed the true nature of arrangements that had been presented as legitimate business transactions. Lucien's response to Kane's veiled threats was immediate and decisive, as 15 years of frontier living had taught him to recognize predators whose success depended on intimidating victims who were too isolated or frightened to resist effectively. His quiet statement that any further contact with his wife would be considered a hostile act was delivered with the kind of calm certainty that professional gunfighters understood meant preparation for violence that would be swift, brutal, and final if circumstances required such response to protect what he valued. The revelation of Lucien's past as a cavalry scout who had survived some of the Civil War's most dangerous missions provided context for understanding why a man of his obvious capabilities had chosen isolation over social interaction, while his demonstration of skills that had been dormant but not forgotten showed that his gentle treatment of Marguerite represented choice rather than inability to deal with threats in more direct fashion. The weapons cache hidden beneath the cabin floor contained enough firepower to equip a small army, while his casual familiarity with instruments of war revealed preparation for conflicts that peaceful ranch life hadn't eliminated. Kane's retreat was tactical rather than permanent, as his parting words about reviewing options for debt collection carried promises of future action that would test whether Lucien's protective instincts were strong enough to risk everything he had built for someone whose welfare had become more important to him than his own safety or security. When Marguerite realized that her past was threatening to destroy the first happiness either of them had found in years, her decision to flee, rather than allow him to sacrifice everything for her protection, would force both to confront feelings that had been growing despite their determination to maintain safe emotional distance. The discovery that Marguerite had left during the night, taking only essential supplies and leaving a letter that explained her decision to protect him by removing herself from his life, created panic in Lucien that revealed how completely his careful emotional defenses had been penetrated by feelings he had sworn never to experience again. Her note, written in the precise handwriting that had graded countless student papers, expressed gratitude for his kindness while insisting that love couldn't justify allowing him to risk everything for someone whose family's mistakes had created problems that would never be completely resolved. The tracking skills that had kept him alive during war and frontier life made following her trail routine despite her careful attempts to conceal her direction, while his knowledge of territorial geography provided understanding of her likely destinations and the dangers she would face. Traveling alone through country where a woman without protection was vulnerable to threats that ranged from natural hazards to human predators who viewed isolated travelers as opportunities rather than people deserving assistance or respect. The blizzard that overtook him during the second day of pursuit created conditions that made continuing search immediately dangerous, but abandoning it potentially fatal for someone inexperienced with mountain weather and survival techniques. Forcing choices between personal safety and desperate determination to find her before exposure, accident, or worse, eliminated any possibility of reunion. His decision to continue despite deteriorating conditions was based on recognition that losing her would destroy something inside him that war hadn't managed to kill despite its best efforts. The cabin where he finally found her, barely conscious from cold and exhaustion, belonged to an abandoned homestead whose previous owners had been driven away by the same kind of criminal pressure that Kane represented, creating ironic shelter for someone fleeing similar threats, while demonstrating how widespread such problems had become throughout territories where law enforcement was inadequate for protecting isolated settlers. Her condition required immediate medical attention that his army training could provide, while her delirium revealed fears and regrets that conscious control had prevented her from expressing. The 3 days they spent trapped by weather in the abandoned cabin while she recovered from exposure created opportunities for honest conversation that their previous careful politeness had prevented, as survival needs eliminated social barriers while shared danger revealed feelings that both had been afraid to acknowledge. When she finally woke to find him maintaining fire and preparing food with the automatic competence of someone whose concern for her welfare exceeded his own comfort, her whispered apology for running away was answered by his admission that losing her would have meant losing everything that made his life worth living. The isolation of the abandoned cabin created an environment where pretense was impossible and emotional honesty became essential for survival. As Marguerite's recovery from exposure required care that involved physical intimacy and vulnerability that normal social conventions would have prevented, Lucien's gentle attention to her needs while maintaining respectful boundaries demonstrated character that had been shaped by genuine honor rather than mere adherence to social expectations, while his obvious distress at her suffering revealed depths of caring that formal marriage arrangements hadn't been designed to create. Her admission that she had been falling in love with him despite her determination to maintain emotional distance was prompted by recognition that death was possible and that honesty was preferable to dying with feelings unexpressed that might have changed everything if circumstances had been different. The tears that accompanied her confession were for opportunities lost through fear and misunderstanding, while her gratitude for his pursuit and care transcended simple appreciation into territory involving profound recognition of his character and commitment that exceeded legal obligations. Lucien's response revealed emotions that 15 years of deliberate isolation hadn't eliminated but had merely suppressed until the right person and circumstances allowed them to surface, despite his conscious determination to avoid the kind of emotional investment that had made losing his family during the war almost unbearable. His admission that her presence had awakened feelings he thought were permanently dead was delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone he used for discussing weather or cattle, but his shaking hands revealed the emotional cost of such honesty. The kiss that followed their mutual confessions was tender rather than passionate, filled with recognition of feelings that had been growing despite obstacles that had seemed insurmountable when they were facing them separately instead of together. The warmth that spread between them had nothing to do with the fire that heated their temporary shelter, and everything to do with emotional connection that transformed their understanding of what their marriage could become when based on choice rather than financial necessity. The storm that had driven them together began clearing as they held each other with careful tenderness that acknowledged both the fragility of their situation and the strength of feelings that had survived circumstances designed to prevent exactly the kind of love that was developing between two people whose lonely lives had been transformed by unexpected partnership. When dawn revealed mountain peaks painted gold by sunrise that seemed to promise better weather and new possibilities, Both understood that their relationship had been fundamentally changed by crisis that had forced them to choose between safety and love, while discovering that the greatest security came from caring about someone whose welfare mattered more than personal comfort or protection. The journey back to their ranch was accomplished through snow that sparkled like diamonds and sunshine that seemed to bless their homecoming, while their conversation during the long ride revealed plans for facing Kane's threats together rather than allowing fear to separate them again. Marguerite's decision to stay and fight was based on understanding that running would only postpone problems while abandoning everything they had built together, while Lucien's relief at her commitment was tempered by recognition that protecting her would require skills and willingness to use violence that peaceful ranch life had allowed him to forget. The changes that were immediately visible around their property indicated that Kane's patience had been exhausted during their absence, as broken fences, scattered cattle, and damage to buildings demonstrated intimidation tactics designed to make continuing resistance seem futile while avoiding direct confrontation that might attract territorial law enforcement attention. The message was clear. Submit to his demands or watch everything they had worked to create be systematically destroyed through methods that provided no clear target for retaliation. The letter waiting inside their cabin contained ultimatums that made Kane's intentions explicit. As his demand for additional compensation in the form of Marguerite's services to his gambling operations was accompanied by detailed descriptions of what would happen to their ranch, their school, and their lives if compliance wasn't immediate and complete. His casual mention of other arrangements that could be made for a woman whose beauty and education made her valuable for purposes beyond teaching children revealed the true nature of his business interests. Lucien's reaction to the threats was cold fury that reminded Marguerite why experienced soldiers had learned to fear quiet men whose anger was controlled rather than explosive, while his immediate preparations for siege warfare demonstrated that his military experience included defensive tactics that could make their ranch into a fortress capable of withstanding assault by forces that relied on intimidation rather than professional combat skills. The weapons that emerged from hidden storage areas transformed their home into armed camp, where every window became firing position and every approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. The telegram that Lucien sent to territorial authorities carried requests for assistance that were phrased in military terms that indicated serious preparation for conflict that would exceed normal law enforcement capabilities, while his message to other ranch families warned of dangers that threatened the entire community's safety and requested support for defensive operations that could protect everyone's children and families. When responses began arriving from neighbors whose own experiences with Kane's organization had taught them to value the kind of leadership that Lucien could provide, both realized that their personal conflict had become community war that would determine whether honest families could build decent lives in territories where criminal organizations were challenging law and order. The ranch families who arrived throughout the following week brought more than moral support, as their wagons contained men whose military experience exceeded Lucien's own, while their determination to protect their children and property created fighting force capable of challenging criminal organizations that had previously seemed invincible due to superior numbers and political connections. The reunion of Civil War veterans who had fought on both sides but were now united by common threats demonstrated how frontier challenges could transcend divisions that had once seemed permanent and irreconcilable. Marguerite's role in coordinating civilian aspects of their defense effort revealed organizational capabilities that teaching had developed, but which military situations demanded in concentrated form, as her plans for evacuating children, protecting supplies, and maintaining communications with territorial authorities required skills that combined educational administration with wartime logistics. Her transformation from frightened bride to community leader was accomplished through recognition that everyone's welfare depended on effective leadership that could coordinate diverse resources and personalities. The intelligence gathering that preceded Kane's expected assault revealed criminal organization that extended throughout territorial politics and business, involving corrupt officials whose protection had made prosecution impossible, while also providing information about law enforcement activities that allowed criminals to stay ahead of official pursuit. The scope of the conspiracy that investigation uncovered made clear that their conflict represented broader struggle between honest settlers and organized crime that threatened democratic development throughout Western territories. The arrival of Deputy Marshal Tom Harrison with federal warrants for Kane and his associates provided legal authority for actions that would otherwise have been vigilante justice, while his coordination with territorial military forces offered possibilities for comprehensive solution to problems that local law enforcement had been unable to address due to corruption and inadequate resources. His recognition of Lucien's military capabilities led to informal cooperation that gave civilian defenders official support without creating jurisdictional problems that might limit their effectiveness. The War Council that met in their cabin brought together military experience, local knowledge, and federal authority in combination that created strategic capabilities exceeding anything Kane's organization had prepared to face. While the unity of purpose that motivated everyone involved demonstrated that frontier communities could organize effective resistance when leadership and coordination were provided by people whose commitment to justice exceeded their concern for personal safety. When plans were finalized for operations that would either eliminate criminal threats or result in their own destruction, both Lucien and Marguerite understood that their love had become foundation for something larger than personal happiness. It had become catalyst for community action that could change the entire territory's future. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday morning when mist rising from the creek provided cover for Kane's hired gunmen, whose assault was designed to overwhelm defenders through superior numbers and professional killing skills that had been proven effective against isolated targets throughout 3 territories. The opening volleys that shattered windows and splintered wooden walls were answered by defensive fire that demonstrated tactical preparation and marksmanship that surprised attackers who had expected easy victory over farmers and their wives rather than coordinated resistance from people whose military training had been dormant but not forgotten. Marguerite's position in the reinforced cabin allowed her to coordinate communications between defensive positions while maintaining accurate rifle fire that kept attackers from advancing across open ground where their numerical advantage would have been decisive. While her calm voice directing defensive movements revealed leadership capabilities that Crisis had developed from natural intelligence and determination. Her transformation from protected victim to active participant in their defense was completed when her shot dropped a gunman who had been flanking Lucien's position. The siege tactics that Kane's forces employed revealed professional military knowledge that exceeded typical criminal capabilities, indicating consultation with experienced soldiers whose services were available to anyone willing to pay for systematic violence and tactical expertise. Their attempts to cut water supplies, eliminate escape routes, and create psychological pressure through sustained harassment demonstrated understanding of siege warfare that made prolonged resistance increasingly difficult despite initial defensive success. The breakthrough that changed everything came when Deputy Marshal Harrison's federal forces arrived with artillery support that transformed criminal assault into hopeless resistance against superior firepower and tactical coordination that professional military units could provide. The sound of exploding shells that scattered Kane's attackers marked the beginning of federal operations that would clean up territorial crime through methods that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities while establishing government authority that criminal organizations couldn't challenge successfully. The personal confrontation between Lucien and Kane during the final assault revealed hatred that had been building since the gambling boss's first threats against Marguerite, while their gunfight in the cabin's main room tested skills and determination that would determine whether justice or criminal arrogance would prevail when individual courage confronted organized evil. When Kane's body fell beside the table where he had first outlined his demands for additional compensation, his death marked the end of criminal career that had terrorized honest families throughout the territory, while also symbolizing triumph of love and community cooperation over threats that had seemed impossible to overcome through legal means. The federal trials that followed Kane's death and the capture of his surviving associates provided comprehensive accounting of criminal activities that had corrupted territorial governance while terrorizing honest settlers whose only crime had been attempting to build decent lives in regions where organized crime had been protected by official corruption. The evidence that emerged from plea bargain negotiations revealed systematic theft, murder, and intimidation that had affected hundreds of families while enriching criminals whose political connections had made prosecution seem impossible until federal intervention changed the balance of power. Marguerite's testimony about her family's victimization by gambling operations that deliberately created debt slavery provided emotional impact that helped juries understand how seemingly legitimate businesses could destroy lives through systematic exploitation of human weakness and desperation. Her composed demeanor and articulate explanation of events that had changed her life demonstrated strength that impressed legal professionals while also revealing education and character that made her credible witness whose statements carried weight with people whose decisions would determine whether justice was achieved. The sentences that were imposed on convicted criminals reflected both the severity of their crimes and federal determination to establish precedents that would deter similar activities throughout territories where law enforcement was still developing capabilities necessary for protecting citizens from organized crime. The executions that followed conviction of gang leaders served notice throughout criminal networks that federal authority would be enforced regardless of political connections or corruption that had previously provided protection from prosecution. Lucien's recognition as territorial hero for his role in organizing community resistance was accompanied by offers of law enforcement positions that would utilize his military experience and leadership capabilities for official purposes, while his declining such opportunities in favor of continuing ranch operations and supporting Marguerite's educational work demonstrated priorities that valued personal happiness and community service over professional advancement or political recognition that many men would have found irresistible. The memorial service for civilians who had died during the conflict honored ordinary people whose courage had made possible transformation of territorial governance from corrupt system that protected criminals into honest administration that served citizen welfare. While the monument that was erected in Silver Creek's main square provided permanent reminder that democracy required constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice from people whose commitment to justice exceeded their concern for personal safety. When territorial newspapers reported that organized crime had been eliminated from regions where it had previously seemed invincible, their stories inspired similar resistance efforts throughout the frontier while discouraging criminal expansion into areas where federal protection was now available. The expansion of their school to accommodate students from throughout the territory reflected growing recognition that education was essential for democratic development in regions where informed citizenship would determine whether honest governance could be maintained against future challenges from criminal organizations or corrupt officials. Marguerite's reputation as educator, whose methods could prepare frontier children for leadership roles in expanding American society, attracted support from territorial authorities whose own success depended on having educated populations capable of effective self-governance. The love that had grown between them during crisis was tested and strengthened by daily cooperation, in work that benefited their entire community, while their mutual respect and growing intimacy created marriage that exceeded anything either had imagined possible when their relationship began as business arrangement motivated by financial desperation. Their partnership demonstrated how shared values and common purpose could create happiness that romantic infatuation alone could never have provided in circumstances that required practical compatibility and emotional maturity. The children who came to their school carried hopes and dreams that education could lift them beyond limitations that frontier subsistence had imposed on previous generations, while their eagerness to learn and determination to succeed reflected community values that emphasized improvement through knowledge and hard work rather than acceptance of circumstances that could be changed through individual effort and collective action. Marguerite's teaching methods that combined academic subjects with practical skills created well-rounded education that prepared students for whatever futures they chose to pursue. Lucien's agricultural innovations that increased ranch productivity while reducing labor requirements created models that other ranchers could adopt for improving their own operations, while his willingness to share knowledge and assist neighbors demonstrated community leadership that transcended business competition and personal advancement. His success in combining military experience with agricultural knowledge provided unique capabilities that territorial development required for establishing stable communities in challenging environments. The announcement of Marguerite's pregnancy was greeted with celebration throughout the region, where her courage and Lucien's leadership had made possible transformation that benefited everyone who valued honest governance and community cooperation over criminal exploitation and official corruption. Their child would inherit not just material prosperity, but also legacy of courage and determination that had changed territorial history while proving that love could triumph over circumstances that seemed impossible to overcome when faced by people whose commitment to each other and their community exceeded their concern for personal safety or comfort. The letter that arrived with the spring mail delivery carried news that shattered their peaceful contentment, as territorial authorities in Washington had received reports questioning the legality of their marriage due to irregularities in documentation that Marcus Kane's criminal organization had used for their fraudulent business operations. The federal investigation that was demanding review of all contracts and agreements associated with Kane's activities threatened to nullify marriages, property transfers, and other legal arrangements that honest people had entered into without knowledge of underlying criminal fraud. The possibility that their marriage could be declared invalid created crises that went beyond legal technicalities into fundamental questions about their relationship and the child they were expecting, while Marguerite's fears about losing everything they had built together were complicated by pregnancy-related health problems that made stress particularly dangerous for both mother and baby. The irony that Kane's death had created new threats to their happiness demonstrated how criminal activities could continue causing damage long after the criminals themselves had been eliminated. Lucien's investigation of their legal situation revealed complexities that exceeded anything frontier law enforcement had prepared him to handle, as federal regulations about territorial marriages required documentation and procedures that Kane's fraudulent operations had systematically corrupted through forged papers and bribed officials whose cooperation had made legitimate verification almost impossible. The legal fees that proper resolution would require exceeded their financial resources, while the time that federal bureaucracy would need for investigation might extend beyond their baby's birth. The community support that rallied around them when news of their legal problems became known included offers of financial assistance and testimony from neighbors whose own marriages and property ownership might be threatened if federal investigations invalidated all transactions connected with Kane's criminal network. Their recognition that personal problems had broader implications for territorial stability created moral obligations that exceeded individual concerns, while also providing political leverage that might influence federal decision-making. The breakthrough that provided hope came when Deputy Marshal Harrison's investigation revealed evidence that Kane's organization had systematically forged marriage documents while legitimate ceremonies had been properly conducted according to territorial law, suggesting that federal authorities could distinguish between criminal fraud and honest transactions that had been corrupted only by association with criminal operations. When Harrison assured them that his testimony would support the validity of their marriage, both realized that their love had survived not only criminal threats, but also legal challenges that could have destroyed everything they had created together. The territorial court proceedings that would determine their marriage's legal status required testimony from everyone who had witnessed their wedding ceremony, creating public examination of private arrangements that revealed how desperate circumstances had forced good people to make choices that conventional society might condemn, but frontier realities had made necessary for survival. Marguerite's composed testimony about her family's situation and her decision to accept arranged marriage demonstrated dignity that impressed legal professionals while also revealing strength that had enabled her to transform unfortunate circumstances into meaningful life. Lucien's defense of their relationship emphasized genuine affection and mutual respect that had developed despite unromantic origins, while his detailed accounting of financial arrangements proved that he had acted honorably throughout transactions that had been corrupted only by Kane's fraudulent documentation rather than any intention to circumvent legal requirements. His obvious devotion to Marguerite and their unborn child provided emotional impact that legal arguments alone couldn't have achieved. The federal prosecutor's investigation revealed that Kane's criminal organization had been systematically corrupting territorial legal processes for years, making dozens of marriages, property transfers, and business agreements potentially invalid due to forged documents and bribed officials whose cooperation had been purchased through systematic corruption. The scope of potential legal chaos that could result from invalidating all transactions connected with criminal activities made comprehensive review impractical, while also demonstrating need for selective prosecution that could distinguish between criminal fraud and innocent victims. The ruling that validated their marriage while establishing procedures for reviewing other potentially affected legal arrangements created precedents for handling territorial legal problems that balanced federal oversight with recognition that frontier conditions often required flexibility in applying regulations that had been written for more settled circumstances. The judge's decision that genuine relationships and honest intentions should be protected despite criminal corruption of legal processes reflected practical wisdom that territorial governance required for effective administration. The celebration that followed their legal victory was tempered by recognition that pregnancy complications were requiring medical attention that frontier healthcare couldn't provide adequately, forcing decisions about whether to risk traveling to Denver for proper medical care or remaining at their ranch where familiar surroundings and community support might be more important than access to sophisticated medical facilities. When Marguerite's condition worsened despite local treatment, both faced possibilities that their legal victory might be meaningless if medical problems prevented them from enjoying the future they had fought so hard to secure. The decision to travel to Denver for medical care was made when local remedies proved inadequate for addressing complications that threatened both Marguerite's life and their baby's survival, requiring dangerous journey through mountain weather that could prove fatal if her condition deteriorated during travel, but which represented their only hope for accessing medical expertise that might save both mother and child. The wagon that Lucien rigged for maximum comfort during the difficult trip contained supplies for extended stay in Denver, while also carrying hopes and fears that had been building since pregnancy had begun. The specialist who examined Marguerite in Denver's new hospital confirmed their worst fears, while also providing hope that proper medical intervention could address problems that frontier conditions had made life-threatening, but which urban medical facilities were equipped to handle through procedures that required skilled doctors and sterile conditions that only established hospitals could provide. The surgery that would be necessary carried risks that frontier women typically couldn't survive, but which represented reasonable chances for success when performed by experienced physicians with proper equipment. The weeks that followed surgery tested every aspect of their relationship, as Marguerite's recovery progressed slowly, while Lucien maintained bedside vigil that revealed depths of devotion that surprised medical staff whose experience with frontier marriages had led them to expect practical arrangements rather than genuine love. His refusal to leave the hospital, despite business obligations at their ranch, demonstrated priorities that placed her welfare above financial considerations or community responsibilities that many men would have found compelling. The birth of their daughter during recovery period that had been complicated by infection and weakness created joy that transcended medical concerns, while also providing motivation for complete healing that mother's instincts demanded, regardless of physical discomfort or medical warnings about limitations that pregnancy complications might impose on future activities. The baby's healthy crying filled hospital rooms with sounds of life triumphant over threats that had seemed overwhelming when facing them, seemed to require impossible choices. The return to their ranch with healthy baby and recovered mother represented victory over challenges that had tested everything they valued, while proving that love combined with medical knowledge and community support could overcome obstacles that might have been insurmountable when faced by isolated individuals. When they saw their cabin surrounded by neighbors who had maintained their property and cared for their livestock during extended absence, both understood that their personal happiness had become part of community welfare that transcended individual concerns while creating obligations and opportunities that would shape their future service to people whose support had made their survival possible. The first anniversary of their legal marriage was celebrated with community gathering that honored their survival of challenges that had tested every aspect of their relationship, while also acknowledging how their love story had catalyzed changes that benefited everyone in the territory. The school that had expanded to serve children from throughout the region demonstrated how individual initiative could create institutions that served community needs, while also providing examples for other territories where similar educational opportunities were needed for democratic development. Marguerite's return to teaching after recovering from childbirth was accomplished gradually through arrangements that allowed her to care for their daughter, while also serving students whose educational needs couldn't be postponed until family obligations were completely satisfied. Her methods for combining childcare with classroom instruction created models that other frontier women could adopt for balancing domestic responsibilities with professional contributions that their communities desperately needed. Lucien's appointment as territorial advisor on agricultural development reflected recognition that his innovations in ranching techniques could benefit other settlers whose success would determine whether territorial development proceeded through sound practices or destructive methods that depleted natural resources while failing to create sustainable prosperity. His willingness to share knowledge while continuing to improve his own operations demonstrated leadership that transcended personal advancement to include community welfare. The letter that arrived from Marguerite's surviving relatives in France provided opportunities for international correspondence that enriched their daughter's cultural education while also maintaining family connections that frontier isolation might otherwise have severed permanently. The gifts and photographs that crossed the Atlantic in both directions created bridges between old-world traditions and new-world opportunities that their child would inherit as natural heritage rather than choices requiring sacrifice of one identity for another. The peace that had settled over their lives was not absence of challenges, but confidence that partnership could overcome whatever difficulties might develop, while their mutual devotion had been proven through crisis that had tested everything they claimed to value about human relationships and community obligations. When neighbors asked for advice about their own relationships and family problems, Both Lucien and Marguerite understood that their love story had become inspiration for others, while also creating responsibilities for sharing wisdom that had been gained through experience rather than theory. The 10th anniversary celebration that filled their ranch with guests from throughout the territory provided testimony to transformations that had extended far beyond their personal relationship into community development that had changed territorial history, while proving that individual courage and love could catalyze social progress that benefited generations of people who would inherit the institutions and values that crisis had created. The children who attended the celebration included their own 3 sons and daughter, whose education was preparing them for leadership roles in expanding American society. The speech that Marguerite delivered to Territorial Educational Conference summarized lessons learned through decade of frontier teaching that had proven conventional wisdom wrong about what was possible when dedicated educators received community support for innovations that addressed local needs rather than simply importing Eastern methods that ignored frontier realities. Her influence on territorial education policy extended throughout Western regions, where similar challenges required creative solutions that combined practical training with academic excellence. Lucien's memoir about frontier law enforcement became required reading at military academies where officers were being prepared for service in territories where conventional tactics were inadequate for addressing challenges that combined natural hazards with human threats, requiring military skills combined with diplomatic sensitivity and community relations that formal training hadn't addressed adequately. His analysis of community organization under hostile conditions influenced federal policy throughout frontier regions. The university that was established in Silver Creek with their donated land and initial funding represented culmination of educational vision that had begun with simple school in converted barn, but had grown through community support into institution that could serve entire territorial population while also attracting students from eastern states whose families recognized quality of education that frontier innovation had created. The medical school that was included in university planning would ensure that future frontier families wouldn't face medical crises that had nearly destroyed their own happiness. The sunset that painted their mountains gold as they sat on their porch, watching grandchildren play in gardens that had been carved from wilderness, provided daily reminder that love combined with determination could create beauty and meaning from circumstances that had initially seemed hopeless when approached through desperation rather than cooperation. Their marriage that had begun as business arrangement motivated by financial necessity had become partnership that changed territorial history while proving that forced beginnings could grow into chosen love when people possessed character sufficient for building something greater than individual happiness through service to community welfare that transcended personal concerns. The legacy they would leave included not just successful children and prosperous ranch, but also institutions and values that would serve frontier democracy for generations, whose freedom would be built on foundations that love and courage had established through crisis, that had tested everything they believed about human dignity and divine providence, working through ordinary people whose extraordinary commitment to each other and their community had changed the world around them in ways that would outlast their individual lives.